knew what they said about this stretch of road, Route 17 North, that thin black vein scraped across the belly of the Canadian Shield. They told me that once the snow hit, the highway didn't belong to the living anymore. I just laughed, wiping the steam from the inside of my windshield. I was running 3 days late, and I had 40 tons of freight strapped behind me. Folk tales don't pay the bills. But the moment I passed the abandoned logging settlement, the one where the houses looked less like they were deserted and more like they had been peeled apart, that laugh caught dead in my throat. The silence out here doesn't just swallow sound, it digests it. It was 2:37 a.m. The engine was a dull, comforting drone, a defiant heartbeat against the vast, smothering cold. The air temperature gauge had been stuck at a grim 20 degrees below zero for hours, but this cold felt different. It was invasive.
A metaphysical cold that seeped into the marrow, regardless of the thick fleece and the humming heater core. I could smell it, the clean, aggressive sharpness of frost mixed with something earthen and deeply unsettling, like wet, pulverized bone. My high beams cut pale, useless tunnels through the infinite darkness. The forest lining the road wasn't just trees. It was a wall of black, skeletal sentinels standing impossibly close to the pavement. They were spruce and pine, but their silhouettes were ragged, twisted. Many of the upper branches snapped off at angles that suggested violence, not wind damage. The warnings had been incessant. The old woman at the diner in Cochrane, her eyes dark and wet, tracing a pattern on the grimy Formica table. Don't stop, son. If the engine dies, lock the doors and pray for the dawn. And whatever you do, don't listen to the sounds. It mimics. I had dismissed it as local color, a way to scare outsiders.
But out here, in a suffocating emptiness, that memory clawed at the back of my mind. The incident started small, insignificant. I'd been driving for an hour past the last known turnoff when my truck suddenly, violently, lurched to the left. It wasn't a pothole. The pavement was pristine. It felt like I'd just hit something heavy, something yielding. But when I looked in the side mirror, the road behind me was empty, glistening black ice reflecting the distant cold stars. My gut twisted. Whatever I hit, it hadn't shattered, and it certainly hadn't bounced. It had just absorbed the impact. I slowed down, my breath clouding the glass. I strained my eyes, trying to peer into the dense timberline. The air was dead still. No wind, no snow, just the constant thrum of my engine. I was about to dismiss it as driver fatigue when I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was a subtle, dry, brittle snap, like a frozen branch fracturing under immense, sudden pressure.
It came from directly to my right, no more than 20 feet into the trees. Then a smell hit me. Instantly, powerfully, a stench so profoundly wrong that it felt like a physical blow. It was the sickeningly sweet, coppery odor of butchery, mixed with the profound sourness of something that had been decomposing for months, all overlaid by a piercing, metallic aroma of ozone and pure, grinding cold. It was the smell of a forgotten meat locker, opening onto the midnight forest. I floored the accelerator, adrenaline injecting itself like ice water into my veins. The truck sped up, the tires biting the asphalt, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade. It intensified. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles were white and painful. I began to talk to myself, muttering about deer, about hallucination, about the pressure of the deadline. Then I saw the first sign that this was not just an empty road. Round a sweeping curve, illuminated harshly by my headlights, was an obstruction.
A vehicle, or what used to be one. It was a late model pickup truck, dark blue, but it wasn't just pulled over. It was fused to the landscape.
It was sitting on the edge of the embankment, tilted at an impossible 30-degree angle. The front end was completely intact, but the rear half of the cab and the entire bed were gone. Not crushed, gone, as if something massive had simply torn it away, like stripping the meat off a carcass. I slowed to a crawl, fear paralyzing my judgment. Why hadn't anyone reported this? It was too recent to be an old wreck. The metal still looked sharp and fresh. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly in a breeze that wasn't there. I stopped the big rig, the air brakes hissing a sharp, terrified sound that was immediately swallowed by the woods. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't operate the shifter. I killed the engine. The resulting silence was an absolute violation. A silence so heavy it felt like cotton forced into my ears.
Didn't want to get out. Every nerve ending screamed the local warning, don't stop. But I had to know if there was a survivor, or at least a reason for the wreckage. I grabbed a heavy mag light from beside my seat. The air that rushed in when I opened the door was the coldest thing I had ever felt. It felt wet and sharp, like breathing pulverized glass. I slid out of the cab, my boots crunching on the loose gravel shoulder. The light beam bounced nervously across the scene. The wreck was horrifying. The way the rear of the truck was missing defied physics. It wasn't an explosion. The metal was cleanly peeled, curled back in sharp, massive strips, like an empty tin can that had been ripped open by colossal claws. And the tracks, beside the pickup, embedded deep into the frozen dirt of the shoulder, were prints. They weren't bear, they weren't moose.
They were immense, long, four-toed indentations that resembled a human foot, only if that foot belonged to something 7 or 8 feet tall. The gait was wide, the strides unnervingly long, and they led directly away from the road, plunging into the black sanctuary of the trees. The smell intensified here, close to the wreckage, rot, and something else. Salt. I stepped closer to the driver's side. The cab was immaculate. The keys were in the ignition. A half-full thermos of coffee sat undisturbed in the cup holder. On the passenger seat was an open map, folded to show Route 17. There was no blood. That was the most terrifying part. No gore, no struggle, just the sudden, clean disappearance of the occupant and the violent evisceration of the vehicle. I shone the light into the darkness where the truck bed used to be. The asphalt beneath it was scraped clean, but I noticed something on the dirt bank, a pile of objects, moving closer. My flashlight settled on the debris.
It was a collection of personal effects. A jacket, a pair of boots, a wallet lying open showing a driver's license photo, a tired, smiling man, and a small, carved wooden doll. The items were not scattered. They were grouped, almost deliberately placed. But what stole my breath, what cemented the fear deep in my chest, was the way the boots and jacket looked. They were not worn or torn. They were empty. The leather of the boots seemed stretched, the laces slack, as if the flesh and bone within them had simply melted away. My flashlight beam danced over the wallet, then froze. Tucked into the clear plastic slot underneath the license was a small, crudely folded piece of paper. I snatched it, my fingers numb and clumsy. Unfolding it, the light revealed a frantic, shaky script scrawled in pencil. I heard it call my name, not mine, hers, my wife. I looked out. I saw what it did to the truck. It's thin, so thin. It told me it was hungry. I shouldn't have stopped.
I shouldn't have looked. A knot had ended abruptly, the pencil stroke dragging off the paper and onto my thumb. The man hadn't been pulled out. He had walked out,
willingly, following a sound or a voice he recognized. This realization hit me with the force of an actual blow. This wasn't a wild animal attack. This was a psychological, insidious predator. They warned me about the mimicry. They warned me about the Wendigo. I scrambled back to my truck, tripping over my own feet, shoving the cab door closed and locking it immediately. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so violently I missed the slot twice. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, profane sound. I threw the transmission into drive, roaring around the ruined pickup truck, not caring if I ripped out my suspension on the uneven shoulder.
You drove blind for several miles, heart slamming against my ribs, watching the rearview mirror, expecting to see the impossible height of that skeletal form loping after me. But the real terror wasn't behind me. It was ahead. I came around a sharp bend, a place where the forest closed in even tighter, where the canopy overhead was so thick it completely blocked the stars, and saw the true roadblock. It was not debris. It was a barricade. 3 immense, freshly fallen pine trees, each nearly a foot thick, lay directly across the road, effectively sealing the highway. They looked like they had been snapped off at the base, not cut, and laid down with intelligent precision. I slammed on the brakes, the 18-wheeler protesting loudly, sliding sideways slightly on the shoulder before arresting 20 feet from the barrier. This was the point of no return. I was boxed in. There was no way around the trees. The drop-off on the side was too sheer, the trees on the left too dense.
This wasn't random. The creature had heard me slow down at the wreck, smelled my fear, and set a trap. It was intelligent. It knew I was here. I killed the engine again, a surge of adrenaline so potent I almost felt dizzy. I reached for my CB radio, but the static was deafening. Not the usual white noise, but a grinding, high-pitched screech that sounded like metal being torn apart. Cell phone? Dead. No signal for 2 hours. I was alone, trapped in a steel box, surrounded by the oldest, hungriest darkness on the continent. I grabbed the heavy bolt cutter I kept behind the seat, the only defense I had, and gripped the handle until my knuckles turned white. I was staring at the impassable barrier when I realized what was wrong with the nearest tree trunk. I lowered my flashlight beam. The wood was deeply marred, not from the fall, but from the process of being torn down. The bark was stripped in long, vertical gouges, like the teeth of an earth mover had raked across it.
My gaze drifted due trunk to the space between the trace fallen trees. The darkness there seemed deeper, thicker. It felt like an open mouth. And that's when the mimicry began. It wasn't a sound of the woods. It was a familiar, close sound, right outside my passenger window. It was the faint, wet sound of human weeping, a tiny, choked sob, the sound of a child lost in the deep woods, afraid and cold. "Daddy," the voice whispered, fragile and high-pitched, barely audible over the remaining hum of my cooling engine. "It's so cold, Daddy. I can't find the truck. I do not have a child. I never have."
But the sound, the pitch, the sheer helpless vulnerability of it resonated in the deep protective instinct of a man alone in the dark. It sounded like pure human desperation, and it was pleading for help. The Wendigo had assessed me. It had found the core weakness, the soft spot in my skepticism. It wasn't trying to lure the missing driver. It was trying to lure me. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my forehead against the steering wheel. Don't listen. Don't look. The weeping intensified, turning into a racking cough, then a desperate whimpering plea. "Please, Daddy, I'm afraid of the tall man." I knew what the tall man was, and the knowledge of its proximity, the fact that it was standing directly outside
outside the thin aluminum door, using that horrific borrowed voice, sent a shockwave of nausea through me. I gripped the bolt cutter so hard my palms were stinging. The sound of the false child's crying filled the cab, filling the world. It was convincing, agonizingly real.
Then, weeping abruptamente stopped. It was replaced by a clicking sound, slow, deliberate, entirely unnatural. The sound of dry, enormous fingernails tapping gently against the heavy glass of my passenger window. Click, click, click. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I simply stared straight ahead into the black wall of the forest and the impenetrable roadblock, knowing that the thing that had annihilated a truck and evaporated a man was 3 inches of laminated glass away from me. Then the tapping stopped and the voice returned. But it wasn't a child this time. It was my own voice, clear, calm, and utterly rational. The voice I use when I'm alone, arguing strategy, calculating fuel mileage. "Just open the door," the voice said from outside the glass, perfectly mimicking my own timbre and inflection. "It's safer out here. You are exhausted. You need to sleep." It knew my deepest, most immediate need, rest. A second of horrifying, tempting delusion washed over me. It's me. I'm just tired. I'll open a door, you walk away from this nightmare. Then the glass rattled, not tapped, ripped. I heard the sound of those immense, dry claws drawing a long, shrieking line across the passenger window, leaving a visible spiderweb fracture in the glass. And the voice changed one last time. It dropped low, becoming a wet, rattling rasp, devoid of any human quality, laced with the smell of frozen earth and hunger. "We are starving. Let us in, and you will be safe." I had stopped on this cursed load. I had investigated the wreck. I had been trapped by the creature's planning. I had ignored every single warning. I turned my head slowly, forcing my eyes to look at the glass fracture beside me. The fracture distorted the reflection, but I could still see the pale, elongated shadow standing outside the cab. It was impossibly thin, a gaunt, horrifying stick figure against the blacker black of the woods.
I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had minutes before that creature, having failed to lure me out, decided to simply peel the steel shell of my truck back like the skin of an orange. The only way out was forward, through the barricade. And the only way through the barricade was to leave the relative safety of the cabin. I took one final, ragged breath, smelling the cold, the decay, and the ozone of pure malice. I had to get out and cut those logs. I had to face the thing that was starving for my body before it decided to invite itself in. I was reaching for the door handle, ready to step out into the true horror of the midnight highway, when the engine of the truck sputtered, then coughed, and died. Total, absolute silence returned. The trap was sprung. And now, I was truly trapped.
The last thing I heard before the silence became unbearable was the distant, drawn-out cry of a desperate human voice echoing from the woods behind me. A new voice, new victim. A sound of unimaginable pain, immediately cut short. The creature was still hungry, and it was coming back to finish me off. I woke up to the smell of old copper and wet earth, realizing with a cold jolt that the silence wasn't protective. It was preparatory. The breath on the inside of the makeshift window was frozen solid, not in the shape of condensation, but in long, vertical streaks, and I knew with sickening certainty it hadn't been put there by me. The shack was worse than cold. It was penetrated by a chill that felt deep, ancient, and hostile. It wasn't merely the temperature dropping. It was the absence of warmth, the literal suction of heat from my body, leaving my skin feeling brittle and tight, like stretched parchment.
Every nail was in searing pain, a mixture of stale wood smoke, deep frozen pine sap, and something thin and metallic, the taste of fear and dried, oxidized blood. I pressed my face against a single grime-coated pane. The moon was a sickly knife-point crescent above the black skeletal trees that crowded the highway's edge. They looked less like flora and more like the ribcage of a colossal, buried thing. That's when I saw the tracks. They were leading away from the rickety door, carved deep into the virgin snow that had fallen hours before I arrived. They were unlike anything natural. Too large, defying the physics of weight distribution, and the stride was impossibly long, leaving vast gaps of undisturbed snow between the imprints.
They were defined, ending in 5 massive, uneven points. But the true terror lay in the faint 5th set of tracks, slightly smaller and shallow, dragging horizontally inside the massive footprints, suggesting the creature walked with a kind of internal, horrific imbalance. I tried to tell myself it was a hoax, a local story exaggerated by isolated workers, but the evidence was too visceral, too real, etched in the frozen landscape just yards away. The distant sound, which I had initially dismissed as the wind sighing through the canyon walls, now resolved itself into something agonizingly human. A scream stretched thin and brittle over miles of freezing air. It wasn't a sudden shriek. It was a drawn-out, desperate sound of pure recognition of doom, cut short abruptly by a wet, sickening crunch. Not a sound of a branch breaking, but the heavy, dense sound of crushing frozen bone, muffled by the distance, yet echoing in my skull as if it happened right beside my ear.
I started noticing these details I had missed in my panicked retreat the night before. The exterior of the shack was riddled with scratch marks, not the parallel rake marks of a bear or mountain lion. These were single, vertical gouges scored deep into the frozen wood, beginning at about 7 feet off the ground and continuing upward, suggesting both immense height and a frantic, clawed attempt to climb something or reach something far above. I was locked in a freezer with a hunter that understood patience and cold. I checked my meager supplies. The truck keys, cold and slick with my sweat, were useless. I tried the ignition one last time, praying for a miracle. Nothing but the dull click of a dead battery. I was marooned. I looked back out the window, desperation overriding caution. The deep snowdrifts near the woods line, 50 yards from the shack, had been disturbed violently, not walked through, but churned as if something massive had thrashed about.
And then I saw it. The object that sealed my fate. The silhouette of my spare 5-gallon gasoline can, which I had strapped securely into the bed of the truck, was now leaning against a distant pine tree. It wasn't merely moved. It had been ripped open. The metal was peeled back like a banana skin, tinfoil impossibly torn by massive brute force. The metallic, sickeningly sweet smell of spilled gasoline reaching me even through the closed door, mingling with the stench of decay that permeated the night air. It wasn't just hungry.
It was playing with me. It didn't want the food right away. It wanted the certainty of my fear, the prolonged agony of realization that I was utterly, irrevocably helpless. I turned back into the dim interior of the shack, my heart hammering a drum roll against my ribs. My eyes scanned the shadows, seeking anything, a hammer, a plank, a heavy rock. I found only dust and despair.
But in the dust, behind the skeletal remains of a rusted wood stove, there was a small, dusty child's boot. It was pristine white, made of soft leather, without a single scuff mark on the toe. It was too small to belong to an adult, too perfect to have been abandoned to the elements years ago. And yet, the lace was tied in a knot, so violently tight, so fiercely pulled, that it had frayed the delicate leather where the bow should have been. It spoke of a final, desperate moment, of someone trying to keep a hold of something precious before the ultimate horror took them. The open loops of terror closed around me. What child? Where did they come from? Why was the boot preserved? And where was the rest of its owner? I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy, rusted tire iron from the corner. The metal was painfully cold in my hand, but its weight was grounding. As I gripped it, I realized the full scope of the creature's intelligence.
It wasn't just a bestial predator driven by insatiable hunger. It was intelligent. The noises it made, the distant howls, the sounds of distress, they weren't random. They were meticulously crafted acoustic lures designed to draw out the weak, the empathetic, the panicked. It was mimicking human suffering to draw its prey into the deep woods. I refused to be lured. I would meet it here, where the structural integrity of the shack, weak as it was, gave me a tiny, temporary edge. Then the silence broke utterly. It wasn't the distant scream again. It was the sound of a large animal, or perhaps something even worse, clearing its throat just outside the door. A deep, wet, rasping inhale, followed by a low, guttural click, like stones being ground together, or dry bone articulating where there should be muscle. The door shuddered, not from a violent assault, but from a deliberate, investigative push.
A latch groaned in protest, metal grinding on wood, sounding deafening and a compressed silence. I braced the tile iron, my knuckles white, focusing on the dark wood of the door, trying to ignore the involuntary tremors running down my spine. It retreated. A brief pause. I heard the sickening, heavy sound of its massive feet crunching through the snow as it moved around the perimeter of the shack, slowly, deliberately circling. Then it stopped directly beneath the window. The glass fogged instantaneously, not with breath, but with a sudden, localized drop in temperature and the sheer physical cold radiating from its proximity. The scent intensified, becoming overwhelming. It was the smell of ancient decomposition, raw stomach bile, and freezing putrid flesh, so potent it tasted like battery acid on my tongue. I gagged, tears streaming down my face, not from fear yet, but from the toxic intensity of the stench.
And then, very slowly, the silhouette of its head rose above the sail. This was the confrontation. This was Wendigo. It was taller than any two men stacked. Skeletal, impossibly thin, fined by famine and desperation. Its body was a monument to starvation. Its skin stretched taut and gray over huge jutting bones, ribs like frozen blades, shoulders sharp enough to cut. Its limbs were disproportionately long, ending in black spade-like claws that scraped silently against the wooden frame.
Its eyes were not eyes. They were deep, empty pits of oily blackness, reflecting only the desolate hunger of the moon above. They held no malice, only necessity, a burning, endless need to consume. The head was crowned by a rack of antlers, bleached white and splintered, seeming to grow unnaturally from the skull, more like dead, desiccated branches than bone. But the mouth, oh God, the mouth.
It was a ruined, gaping mass, the needle-like yellow teeth constantly vibrating with a low, despite hiss, a sound of profound internal suffering. Saliva, thick and black as crude oil, dripped slowly from the ruins of its lips, instantly freezing into grotesque icicles on its chin. It didn't roar, it didn't growl. It made a sound of profound, agonizing emptiness. A high, whistling moan that echoed the scream I had heard moments before. A perfect, mocking imitation of human despair. It launched. The speed was terrifying, less like a natural predator and more like a massive skeletal projectile. The window exploded inward in a shower of pulverized ice and glass shards. I reacted purely on instinct, driving the rusted tire iron upward. I heard the sickening snap of the metal connecting with something impossibly dense. Not flesh, but dense, ancient bone, followed by a high, mechanical shriek of fury. It recoiled, briefly stunned, allowing me the crucial split-second opportunity to flee. I didn't stop to think, vaulting over the debris and kicking the fragile door open. I bolted out into the freezing air, the sound of the creature tearing the shack apart behind me, its claws ripping through wood like tissue paper. The open highway, the road that had betrayed me, was my only escape. I ran, every muscle protesting the cold and the exhaustion. The freezing air burned my lungs, and the snow was a treacherous obstacle. The climax was desperate, terrifyingly close. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thudding of its approach behind me. It was gaining ground with terrifying speed. I risked a glance over my shoulder. It was running on all fours now, a low, ground-skimming gallop, its skeletal form blurred by speed, kicking up sprays of snow.
Its mouth was wider now, an impossible cavern of hunger, and the high, agonizing whistle had turned into a full, shattering shriek, a sound that contained the despair of every soul it had ever consumed, driving directly into my brain, threatening to fracture my sanity. I stumbled, falling hard onto the ice, the tire iron skittering away uselessly. I scrabbled backward, trying to crawl, tasting the metallic cold of the frozen asphalt. It was upon me. The massive shadow blotted out the moonlight, the sheer weight of its hunger, the physical presence of its cold. It was like being submerged in freezing water. I felt its icy, hard touch, not claw, but the crushing grip of its massive hand clamping down on my shoulder. I didn't fight. I simply froze, paralyzed by the overwhelming reality of the horror. I looked up into those pits of blackness, and in the reflection, I saw not my own terrified face, but a brief flash of red, like flickering embers, deep inside the creature's skull.
Then, from a sudden, blinding flash, the light pierced the darkness, accompanied by a distant, angry blare. A semi-truck, an impossibly large lifeline, sped around the blind corner, its horn screaming a furious warning, and the Wendigo recoiled with an unnaturally fast, serpentine movement, releasing my shoulder. The light had pierced the deep shadow it relied upon. It didn't retreat to the woods. It simply melted back into the shadows of the concrete barrier, moving with an impossible fluidity.
disappearing into the ambient darkness of the cold night as swiftly as a puff of smoke. The truck roared past, shaking the ground, the driver oblivious to the creature that had stood inches from me. I was left alone, bleeding, hyperventilating, smell of burnt diesel momentarily displacing the stench of rot. I lay there for what felt like hours, until the first hint of sickly gray light touched the horizon, illuminating the ravaged remnants of the shack. The creature was gone. I survived.
I don't know why. Perhaps the truck's sudden appearance was enough. Perhaps the Wendigo decided I was too much trouble, too small a meal for the effort required. But I was not whole. My sanity was fractured, my body broken. I was eventually found. Miles down the road, shivering uncontrollably. Now I am confined to a sterile hospital room, wrapped in thick blankets, but I still feel the penetrating ancient cold of the creature's touch. The doctors call it hypothermia and trauma.
And sometimes, when the wind outside this hospital window hits the glass just right, I hear it, that distant, agonizing human whistle, stretched and thin, echoing across the miles, and I know the monster didn't leave the highway. It just finished its meal. It is waiting for the next snowfall, the next traveler who ignores the local warnings. It is patient, and it is always, always hungry. Stay vigilant, lock your doors, and never trust the silence of the remote woods. If you want more stories that pull the shadows out from beneath your bed and leave you questioning what is real, subscribe. Don't let the darkness claim you alone. Sweet dreams, if you manage to have them.